So let's get into the Q&A session. With everything leaders have to manage, why should they focus on culture?
Yeah, I acknowledge that culture is kind of a soft thing. And I have to tell you, one of my pet peeves is this notion of soft skills and hard skills. That soft skills are the people stuff in the culture, and somehow that's soft. But, if you've ever fired anyone or had a difficult conversation or had to visit a waiting room where someone got hurt, that's your soft skills. So to me, I think it's important. Obviously, I have a bias, but there's some hard business reasons. One is culture is your differentiator. Your culture is not easily replicated by the competition. It's one of the hardest things to replicate. They can buy the same equipment and do all that, but if you have a strong culture, that's a very difficult thing to beat. It also tends to attract the kind of people that you want, and people will stay for a good culture. And the third thing is your culture is always at risk, because left alone, cultures don't get better, they get worse. So you have to pay attention to it and just make sure you have the culture that you want.
Okay, good. Well, does everyone have to be a complete and full commitment to have a safety culture?
I don't think that's realistic. That would be wonderful if everyone was at full commitment, but I don't think it's realistic. I usually find when I'm working with groups, there's usually less than 10% of people who will say they're fully committed. And we can argue whether they are or not, but I think what you want to get is, there's sort of a core group, and Buckminster Fuller called it the TrimTab Factor. Some of you may be familiar with this concept, but if you look at the Queen Mary, 30,000 tons of ocean liner, there's a big thing on the back called the rudder that turns it, but there's a little thing on the rudder, it's a rudder for the rudder, called the trim tab. And that little rudder turns the big rudder, which turns the whole ship. That trim tab is about 15%. And Buckminster Fuller studied organizational change, and he said, if you can get 15% of the people moving and committed to a certain direction, the ship will turn. But the flip side is, if you get 15 people committed to being resistant to change, the ship turns that way. So I go with Buckminster Fuller. He invented the geodesic dome. That's good enough for me.
Okay. Shouldn't every worker have the authority to stop any work if he or she believes there's a hazard that has been dealt with?
Yes. Yes. And they should have the courage to do it. I think a lot of times it's an emotional issue. You have to have the courage to stand up. Maybe you're not the most senior person on the team, and they all think it's safe, and you have to be the one who stands up and says, I don't think this is safe. It's the skunk at the picnic. Or if your supervisor might yell at you for stopping the job. I think it's a really difficult decision, and people should have the authority and be supported. And when it happens, how we react to that is really important too. It has to be supported.
Good point. This person had a part two, which you've touched on, but maybe in a little more.
I'm sorry, I don't take part twos.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm just kidding. I'll take part 2 or 3.
Well, he wants to know how, and exactly, if you could, with what words do you get workers to look out for each other's safety that way?
I've heard a lot of different things, and again, I steal shamelessly and share graciously. I just worked with an organization recently who started a program called Our Brother's Keeper. And it was starting to talk to the supervisors and people about this is our value. It's we all go home safe or we don't. And it's watching out for each other. And one of the big issues I know a lot of times is between trades. So you're on a big job and the electricians aren't necessarily going to watch out for the iron workers or whatever it is. And as a former Teamster, I can tell you, I understand how that goes. But I think it's absolutely crucial that you talk to people and say, this is the value of the company, and this is an expectation, that you can't walk by stuff. We own it. We all own everything. And that it gets back to the stopping the work if you see something. But part of it is just keep your eyes open and own it. And by the way, that's not one conversation or one meeting. That is an ongoing conversation, but it has to be important to the leadership, and then they have to make that clear that it's important to everyone.
And I guess back to what you said earlier, it's also how, when they do that, how everyone reacts to it.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
you reinforce that as a positive thing versus a negative thing, that's going to impact.
Can I tell a quick story, Jack?
Sure.
I promise it'll be quick, but I think it's an illustration of this. I was sitting at a meeting, it was about 6 in the morning. It was a team of people who unloaded barges, and they were having a safety meeting before their shift. And what they were doing was they were online watching some, and I don't remember if it was the Coast Guard or the Corps of Engineers, but they had some online videos that were computer-generated scenarios of actual accidents that had happened to barge loaders. So they show the accident and the computer generated, and then they'd show what the problem was and they'd show what you could do about it. So they were watching that and then having a conversation. So they get done, they've all watched it, it's early morning, they're ready to go to work. And the foreman said, "Is everybody clear? Does everybody understand this?" And one young man, actually the newest member of the team, said, "I don't get it." He said, "Can we watch it again?" And so they said, sure. So they watched it again, went through it, had a conversation, and everybody wanted to make sure he understood, and he did, and then they went to work. And I was astonished, not so much, well, first that he spoke up, I thought that was impressive. But the thing that astonished me was that there wasn't a lot of eye rolling or the rest of the team going, "Oh God, please, do we have to do this?" They all just went, okay. And I talked to the foreman afterwards, and he said, "We know that if anybody on this team doesn't know what they're doing, we could all get hurt. So we don't leave the meeting until everybody's got the safety message." And to me, that was a little culture of that team, was we're all watching out, we're all watching out for each other. And by the way, if you're fully committed, that's a given. I'm not gonna let you be unsafe. If I see you doing something, I'm gonna intervene because that's my commitment.
Okay, good, excellent. That's a great story. Well, are certain generations, i.e. baby boomers or millennials or Gen Xers, more compliant, more safety focused than others, or does age even factor into it?
Let me give you the consultant's most hated answer. I have no idea. I wish I did. I don't know. I know a couple people who do a lot of millennial or research on different generations. I've never seen anything about that particular one, but I would imagine there may be people in this room who have an answer to that, and I'd welcome the help.
Okay.
But I have no idea if there's a difference in,
Fair enough.
in that.
And when we asked you to do this, you know, when I was talking to you about doing this you said you knew everything.
Jack, there's a difference between selling a thing and then doing a thing.
I should have known.
Yeah, it's
Well,
marketing.
you're obviously a good salesman.
Next, you'll want the brochure to actually be like the product.
Yeah, well, that would
Come
be
on.
good. Yeah, absolutely.
That's crazy talk.
Well, how does the management of a construction firm maintain the firm's safety values when they're working for an owner, maybe that doesn't share those values? Or I suppose it could be a subcontractor working for a general contractor.
Yeah.
But that's one of the challenges, as you know, we have in the construction industry.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I know that working with companies that do a lot of commercial work, traditionally commercial clients and owners have not been as concerned about safety as, say, industrial clients. I know, same company that I was working with, their industrial clients actually push them harder on safety than they do. Their commercial side, they're basically, just get the building up. We're not too concerned about your safety. So they are constantly trying to sell both ways. On the one hand, they love working for the industrial customers who just have a very high bar, the petroleum companies, et cetera. And so they learn a lot from them. And when it's done right, the customers they'll share ideas. They'll have joint safety committees, and they really up the bar. But when you're working for a client who doesn't care as much, there's some front-end selling that they try and do to show them why this is going to be good for the owner. So it's kind of a sales job. On the sub side, that I think is a challenge facing a lot of organizations now that don't do self-perform, that it's how do we get these people on board? Because traditionally they, especially the smaller ones, may not have spent the resources, time, and energy on this, but it starts with the bidding process. I mean, if it can be part of the bid that this is the level of safety that we expect, orientation, all those things, again, to lay the groundwork. And I always advocate, get with the principal of the sub to compare core values, and then get with those on-site superintendents, project managers, to make sure the leadership is in alignment. Because one of the problems with values and culture is when there's a thermal layer. Like everybody has the same values, it gets to one point and then it kind of gets diffused and goes sideways.
Okay. So here's a good one. Do you have any advice for a family-owned company who is transitioning generations of owners? So in other words, they've got owners and some long-term employees that are going to transition out, and trying to take safety to the next level. I guess the new ones are trying to, but they're experiencing some resistance from the older leaders and supervisors.
Yeah. I think in my work with, and I guess I prefer the term business families, I just think that tends to be more what it is, but I've worked for some in my career. I think the thing that keeps coming up over and over, the hardest thing is for the previous generation to know when to let go. I think that's the hardest, seems to be the biggest problem, is to step back. So it tends to be a long goodbye, and as opposed to just kind of pulling it. So it's very tricky. I would advocate, there's a lot of people who specialize in working with business families, and I think anytime you can get some help and get people in there to kind of talk you through it, because it's very tricky and it's fraught with things that regular businesses don't have to worry as much about. But on the other hand, they can be unbelievably strong cultures. I mean, some of the strongest cultures I've ever seen are within business families. But when they kind of go sideways, it can be very, very damaging. And especially for the employees, because they're the ones kind of go, Mom and Dad are fighting. Not quite sure how this is going to work out. And then that's when things get sideways.
Yeah. So here's another one, this kind of the general subcontractor issue, but turned around the other way. As a subcontractor committed to safety, can you nurture a culture of safety if you continue to take jobs and work for a contractor that doesn't necessarily match your safety commitment? How do you keep the balance?
Yeah.
I guess this is the old production versus safety issue.
Yeah, and also, on that side of it, that's really the core value issue is, on the one hand, we need to make money and keep the business, and on the other hand, our core value is we don't necessarily want to do that job. So how do you find that middle ground? One thing you might say is, okay, how can we make it as safe as we possibly can? So we don't want to go away from our values, even though it might not be supported from the customer or from the general contractor. But I think as soon as we start to slide away from our values, that's a very dangerous road, because we get that I think there's a big shot scientific term. It's called the normalization of deviance, which is not nearly as fun as it sounds, but it means that if you deviate a little from where you want to be, and then that becomes standard, and then a little more, and pretty soon you're out in left field without a glove. And that's the danger when we start to slide on our values. But having said that, I completely recognize that in the real world, you have to take work. And the other side of that is general contractors often have to work with subs that they don't want to. I heard a guy in a very candid statement say, we will never work with that subcontractor again unless they're low bid. And that's real. I mean, and so this is, I always try and operate in the real world as much as I possibly can. So it's a constant battle, but everything starts with an acknowledgement of what's important to us, what are we willing to do, what will we not tolerate, and then let's have the conversation. And I think when we talk to each other, talk to subs, have the meetings, have the conversations, we have a better chance of getting it right.
Do you find it easier or more difficult to influence a safety culture in organizations that are unionized as opposed to ones that are not? I find differences, but they don't tend to be union or non-union. It's more the company, the part of the country. I've been in companies where the union was the strongest pusher of the safety, and then in other ones where it was so contentious that if the owner had said, I absolutely support safety, the union would have said, we hate safety and we're never doing it, and vice versa.
It was just, you know, we're having a pitch battle. You say yes, I say no, it doesn't matter what. So I don't find it breaks on those lines. It's much more specific than that. It depends on the union. By the way, that's the other consultant's favorite phrase. It depends. But in this case, it's true. It depends.
Yeah, makes sense. Is a zero-injury culture possible and attainable? Key objectives to achieve it. What are some of the things to think
What was the last part?
It just says key objectives to achieve.
Okay. Is it possible? Of course. Of course. Is it achievable? Of course. If you don't believe that, you would never endure the struggle. You just wouldn't do it. It's too hard. It costs money. But of course it is. Will I see that in an organization I'm working with in my lifetime? I don't know. That's not the point. I want to get closer. I want to be continuously improving. To me, that's the real target. But you have to have a goal out there. And if your goals are too easy, then people slip back into complacency. So.
Okay. What is the best safety incentive program you've ever encountered?
The one that keeps changing. That's the one. What I've seen successful in safety incentives is the ones that are constantly changing and evolving. Where I think safety incentives get in trouble is, you know, okay, we're going to have a safety luncheon and we're going to barbecue and we're going to have raffles and we're going to give $50 away, or we're going to give gas cards. And then, you know, well, we did gas cards for a while, so now we're going to do TVs. I think whatever you do, you need to change it up and keep it fresh. So I think the main thing is that you're recognizing and rewarding and sending the messages that safety is important. And sometimes the most important recognition is the one-on-one. When you catch someone being committed to safety or being safe, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but you walk up and just say, hey, I saw you do that, I really appreciate it. And just keep your eye open for catching people doing things safely.
So a lot of the people in the audience are underwriters or brokers, and they want to know how to recognize a safety culture. So the question is, can you give some examples you've seen of companies present the idea of committed versus compliant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples of, you know, when I go into a company, if I go in and do a cultural audit, what I'm looking for is, what do people talk about? What stories do they tell? What are the legends? What are the artifacts? What's the one thing that everybody talks about? Also, I'm going to find out pretty quickly, and when I sit down and interview somebody, I'm going to find out what's important in that organization. Just little things like, you know, how do you deal with X? You kind of find out what's okay and what's not okay with a company. And one example I have is a CEO who told me, he goes, you ask anybody, I was Mr. Productivity, Mr. Hard Ass, I kicked everybody, we got to get this done, and that's what I focused on until they had a death on one of their job sites. And he said, after that, I was sitting in the emergency room with the family, the employee died, and he said after that, I almost had a heart attack. It was so hard on me, he said, I can never go through that again. So after that, he was committed to safety, but it took about 4 years for anybody to believe him. Because after 20 years of being the hard driver, they went, what's he up to? But he was persistent, and it came up all the time. Every time he talked about safety. That's an indicator of a safe culture. The other thing is, if you hear the same message from the top all the way through the organization, again, I mentioned that thermal layer. The other thing I look for is, I'll give you an example. This is kind of a bad example, but I had an organization and I was interviewing the president of the company, and he said, here's the most important thing in this company, and it was the 5 S's. And for the life of me, I don't remember what the 5 S's were, but it was, safety was one of them. I remember that. Oh, and one was a $sign. So, but there were other S's. I don't know what it was. Anyway, he said the 5 S's. Everybody knows this. This is what we run our business by, the 5 S's. I interviewed his 2 direct reports. They talked about the 5 S's, very important. Nobody else, I did 100 more interviews. Nobody mentioned the 5 S's. And the president was shocked. He said, I talk about this all the time. I said, nobody brought it up. And he said, well, did you ask them what it was? I said, I did, and some knew, and I went, oh yeah, I think, I don't remember what the S's were. And some had never heard of it. And he was shocked. He said, I would have sworn that message was getting through. I said, well, is that still an important message? So how can you make sure you push that through? But when you're working with clients, I think you have an unbelievable opportunity to help them understand the value of culture. You don't necessarily have to know how to create a great culture or do anything. Just draw it to their attention and say, here's some things that we know work really importantly in cultures, because there's lots of different values, but we have more people that are committed than compliant. We live our values and not just talk about them, and we do everything we can to support people making safe decisions. Those are the kind of things you look for. So whenever you can have a conversation about culture or commitment or safety, boy, I would urge you to do that.
Well, this is probably the most important question that I've gotten to ask you, and it's from an attendee from St. Louis. Why the heck didn't the Cards win?
Just the nice, stop saying that. Make the bad man stop. Make him stop. I believe, and this is a theory that I believe that injuries, all teams have injuries, but that was a bit of a problem. I think the main thing was Jose Oquendo got hurt in spring training, and his coaching was not around to develop the younger players and straighten some things out. And I think that's the reason that they did not win.
Okay.
Plus the Cubs had some magic mojo thing going on. Fine, you won. Now go back to where you belong. Tampa Bay, the Florida Marlins won the World Series a few years ago. Forgotten. This is how a Cardinals fan lives through this nightmare scenario. The world doesn't make sense. The Cubs win? What? That can't be right. But they did a great job. It was a fun World Series to watch, even without the beloved Redbirds.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Please, everyone, stay with us for a few more minutes as we recognize some individuals for innovation in construction risk management with the presentation of the Gary E. Bird Horizon Award. But first, please join me in thanking Ron for his insights.
Thank you all.
Terrific.